We've got a system that is broken and it hasn't been fixed, not because we don't know how to, but because of the political lack of courage in Congress.
Hello, I'm Bonnie Erbay. Welcome to the Contrary, a discussion of news and social trends from diverse perspectives. This week I'm joined by woman thought leader, Representative Pramila Jayapal from Washington State. Representative Jayapal, welcome to the program.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, you are a relatively senior member of the House because you've been here more than 2 years. But things really changed. You were elected in 2016.
Right.
2018, a flood of new women entered the Democratic caucus in the House.
Right.
How has that changed things for you?
Well, it's been amazing. I just have to say it's like a breath of fresh air. When I came in, I was the first South Asian American ever elected to the U.S. House, and one of very, very few women of color at the time, one of very few women. I mean, we didn't have a big flood in 2016. And of course, we were dealing with the election of Donald Trump and being in the minority. Now we have this incredible, vast array of talent, really, that's come in. Incredible diversity, the most diverse, the most progressive House we've ever seen. The first two Native American women, the first two Muslim American women, a whole host of Latinx and African American women. It's really been wonderful.
Now, obviously, the goals of all those women together are to push the legislation that is more of a progressive bent. How successful do you think you've been in that regard?
Well, I think we've been doing incredibly well. Now, of course, not all of the women that were elected are members of the Progressive Caucus, but we have increased the Progressive Caucus's size. We are now almost 100 members strong, about 40% of the caucus, and I'm the elected co-chair of the Progressive Caucus. I think that the movement across the country has been amazing. It's not just what has happened here in Congress, but the strength of the progressive movement of young people, folks of color, women speaking up and saying, we need reform on essential things. If you look at the major pieces of legislation that the House has passed since we've taken over 50 major pieces of legislation, many of them progressive priorities, getting money out of politics. That was H.R. 1, the first bill we passed. The $15 minimum wage, which we were on the forefront of in Seattle, also we've passed. Gun reform, 3 pieces of gun reform legislation, very, very important to all of us across the caucus. So these things that we used to think of as progressive priorities now are really mainstream Democratic caucus priorities. Issues like Medicare for all, we have over half of the caucus supporting my Medicare for all bill. And then, of course, on immigration, the most progressive DREAM Act that we have ever passed in the history of the House.
But how frustrating is it to you that with a Republican Senate and with probably one of, if not the most conservative Republican presidents in the White House, that these aren't becoming law?
It's a dereliction of duty on the Senate's part. Mitch McConnell is just sitting there with all these pieces of legislation doing absolutely nothing. We call the Senate the graveyard where all good ideas go to die. And that is wrong because it's not what the American people want. Let's just look at background checks as an example. 90% of the American public wants to see background checks passed. Money in politics, this is a top issue across Republican and Democratic districts. The DREAM Act, this used to be a bipartisan issue that should be able to get attention in the Senate. So it is frustrating, but I will tell you that there is a very clear distinction between Democrats and our proposition agenda and Republicans and their purely opposition agenda.
Let's talk about immigration for a couple of minutes because you've sponsored several bills on that issue. And of course, it's really the issue that catalyzed President Trump's campaign and got him into the White House. What's it like to be pro-immigrant and pro-immigration these days? Is it I mean, you weren't here before President Trump was in office, but from what members of Congress tell you who feel similarly.
Well, I'm here as one of only 14 members of the United States Congress, both House and Senate, that is a naturalized citizen myself. So I was born in India. I was naturalized as a U.S. citizen in 2000. And it's a real honor to be able to serve here now. And in some ways, I feel like it's more important than ever that I am here and that this voice is so clearly being articulated exactly because Trump has decided to vilify and otherize and terrorize immigrant communities across this country simply for his own political gain. And I don't
You don't think he believes in what he's doing personally?
Maybe now, but I don't think he came in believing that. He has followed the direction of Stephen Miller and anti-immigrant forces within the White House that he brought in. White supremacist forces, I mean, these are all interrelated. And now the goal is not just about the border, not just about undocumented immigrants. It is literally to reduce or eliminate the flow of legal immigrants. If you look at what he's done with refugee admissions, asylum seekers, if you look at even what he said about legal immigrants with the public charge rule, all the new regulations, the Muslim ban. I mean, these are all attempts to restrict even legal immigration to this country, and it's a travesty. So what does it feel like to be here now? It feels important. It feels important to get the voices of so many people across this country that epitomize the value of immigrants to the United States. And it also feels very, very important for us to be able to show what our vision is of immigration to this country.
Your vision, tell me a bit about that. Is immigration a net contributor to the economy? Does it create more jobs? Or the other way around?
Absolutely. And I spent 15 years as an immigrant rights activist for across my state and across the country. And what we know is that this country is stronger for immigration. In spite of everything that Donald Trump has done, the public still believes that we need more immigration, not less. So he has not been effective in changing the views of people who in many cases are very connected to their own immigrant histories. This country has always had a very back and forth relationship with immigration. We have had a lot of exclusionary policies since our founding. We have had a lot of amnesties. If we say that sometimes that's used by our Republican colleagues in a bad way, but in fact that's been the history throughout the history of this country. We've had amnesties of people that came from other Western European countries. So the reality is we've got a system that is broken and it hasn't been fixed, not because we don't know how to, but because of the political lack of courage in Congress. For me, it really is about who we are as a country. Immigration has never been just about immigration policy to me. It has always been about who we are as a country. And we have thrived because we have been able to take people from other countries who are seeking refuge, yes, but also who add so much to who we are as a country. Immigrants have built our railroads, built so much of our infrastructure. They've contributed to our services, to the doctors and lawyers and professionals across the country. They are innovators. They're women who keep families together. This is the nature of who we are as a country, and to turn our back on immigration as a core competency and policy value of the United States is not just deeply hurtful, which it is, but very, very detrimental to the growth and the well-being and the future of America.
You have, 4 bills on immigration, right? Do any of them have a chance of becoming law with the Republican Senate, with the Donald Trump in the White House? And if not, how long before you think they will have a better chance of becoming law?
Well, I pride myself on laying out a proposition agenda for Democrats on immigration. And sometimes proposition agendas mean that you have to lay out a vision and then you have to work to get it. So they are sensible bills that should absolutely be put into law. One, for example, is called Dignity for Detained Immigrants. And it says that American taxpayers should not be spending enormous amounts of money incarcerating immigrants who should not be in jail to start with in for-profit prisons. I don't want my taxpayer dollars wasted in that way. And I certainly don't want people jailed and incarcerated who should not be because they've never been charged with a crime, much less committed a crime. And that is the vast majority of the 56,000 immigrants who are incarcerated every single day. So we were able to have the first hearing on that bill in the Immigration Subcommittee, and I chaired that hearing. And it was really fantastic to just be able to see that issue that I've worked on for a decade move forward. I am not a short-term thinker. I believe that we have to build the movement and we have to educate people about what's happening. And so, you know, I think that even though this bill probably won't be enacted by this president, none of these will. Not even reasonable proposals to keep refugee admissions at 110,000. Always a bipartisan priority.
Knocked down at this point to, I believe, 18,000?
18,000, the lowest level in the history of our country. And you know what is so crazy about that, Bonnie, is in Washington State, for example, the Vietnamese population came as refugees, Vietnamese Americans now came as refugees brought by a Republican governor. Dan Evans was essential in that. And that's true in states across the country. The Evangelical Association has called our refugee resettlement program the crown jewel of American humanitarian assistance. And yet this is what the president is trying to take away.
And the evangelicals are his base. I mean, that
they are.
And so how do you square that? If they are so concerned about immigrants, why do they support a president who calls them criminals and rapists?
That is the million-dollar question, and it is true on other things too. When you think about faith, the faith community has been one of our strongest allies in pushing for immigration reform, pushing for a real solution to our broken immigration system.
Are these the same people who are voting for Donald Trump?
Some. I mean, not all. You know, I think there are a lot of people of faith who think that what he's doing is reprehensible. There are a lot of Republicans who think what he's doing is reprehensible. I remember when Laura Bush wrote an article, an op-ed in the New York Times saying that family separations were horrible. I forget what exact words she used, but these should not be democratic concerns. They should be human concerns about how we treat people with dignity and respect. And I do believe that as much as Donald Trump wants to use immigrants to shore up his base, he is losing independent voters, women voters, who cannot see any reason that we should be separating babies from their moms and dads, cannot see any reason why we wouldn't welcome refugees into the country, cannot see a reason why we have to incarcerate asylum seekers who are trying to escape political violence in their countries.
Now let's talk a little bit about your sponsorship of Medicare for All. First of all, a major proponent is, of course, Bernie Sanders, and you endorsed him 4 years ago when he ran.
Right.
Are you going to endorse him again this time?
I haven't made an endorsement yet. I work very closely with Senator Sanders, obviously on Medicare for All, also on my College for All bill. And so, you know, he's very dear to me. I also work very closely with other candidates who are running for president. I'm the main co-sponsor of Elizabeth Warren's anti-corruption bill. And I've continued to work with her on a number of things, Kamala Harris, Cory Booker. So I haven't figured out what I'm doing yet in the presidential election, but what really excites me is the strength of the progressive ideas that Bernie and Elizabeth in particular are putting forward, and the deep needs that they are speaking to around structural reform. How do we change the structures that exist so that we can have equity, equality, and justice at a time when 3 people in the United States of America have the same combined wealth as 160 million Americans combined? We have deep work to do to really make sure that the opportunity that was available to me as a 16-year-old who came here as an immigrant with nothing in my pockets by myself, and now to be a congresswoman, that should be available to anybody across America. And I don't think it is.
Why? Because of the change in wealth accumulation and the growing gap between rich and poor?
Yeah,
here?
it's complicated. I think it's on both ends of the spectrum. So on the bottom end of the spectrum, you have wages that have stagnated, and so many people, tens of millions of people across the country, who are working 40 hours a week, but they are not earning enough that they can actually put food on the table and have a roof over their heads and send a kid to college, much less save anything. So raising the minimum wage is critical. As you know, the minimum wage has not been raised. Federal minimum wage has not been raised in so long. And if we had tied it to inflation, it would be over $21 at this point. It is at $7.25. The tipped minimum wage even less. So we're taking a whole group of, particularly women, folks of color, who have to now rely on tips as part of their minimum wage. It's outrageous. So our Raise the Wage Act that we passed as Democrats in the House addresses that. We get to a $15 minimum wage, and we eliminate the federal tipped minimum wage. So that's one piece of it. The other piece of it is the other side, and this is a really important piece, which is the lack of paying your fair share. This is for corporations, the wealthiest people in this country. If you look at how wealth is taxed in this country, you really have disproportionate amounts of people who are low income or middle income who are paying enormous amounts of their income in taxes, but the wealthiest are not, the wealthiest corporations. So our tax structure has to be changed so that a little bit of that gets earned can be shared so that people can have basic things like paid childcare, family medical leave, all of these things that really should be essential in a country that is the most, one of the most advanced and most rich in the world.
Getting back to Medicare for all, how would you pay for that?
Well, the interesting thing about healthcare costs in this country, one of my favorite topics, is we are paying $3.5 trillion a year in healthcare costs today in this country. It is going up to almost $6 trillion over the next 10 years. And that cost should be thought of as a giant tax on Americans right now that people are paying. It comes in the form of out-of-pocket costs, deductibles, private insurance premiums. So let's not think about this separate from what we're currently paying. Medicare for all.
So does that 3.45 trillion you mentioned, does that include Medicare?
Well, yes, it does. So about 2/3 of that total amount is paid for by the federal government right now. Medicare, Medicaid, insurance subsidies. And the rest of it is paid for by individuals, you and me, when we go and we have to pay an out-of-pocket cost or a deductible or a premium, or through corporations. So corporations are paying about $750 billion in private insurance premiums. Now, they're paying it to the insurance companies. They could certainly pay all or a portion of that to the government. And the dollars that you and I are spending, if you could spend less than that, and you could get more for it, wouldn't you want to do that? Because right now you're spending that amount of money, but you're not even getting comprehensive care. The biggest insurance program that people go to is GoFundMe. That's not sustainable. But on top of that, you've got people who can't afford insulin treatments, can't afford their cancer treatments, get a surprise bill that's $20,000, mortgage their homes, cut their pharmaceutical drugs in half so that they can, try to push out their prescriptions longer. That's unacceptable. 70 million Americans who are either uninsured or underinsured, and tens of millions more who simply cannot afford their health care, even when they have health insurance. So Medicare for all, even by conservative Koch brothers estimates, would cost $3.2 trillion a year. That is significantly less than the $3.5 trillion that we currently expend on health care. and certainly much, much less than $6 trillion. So you got to cover everybody and you have to contain costs. And the only way to do that really is through a single payer healthcare system like Medicare for All.
So you would take all the, I'm presuming as part of that package, you would take all the money that's going to insurance companies to decide who and what gets paid of the medical bills for people who are insured, and use it instead to fund the actual healthcare system.
Right.
Pay doctors, pay hospitals.
Right. We Medicare for All keeps the same network of doctors and hospitals, except you actually have real choice that's not dictated by an insurance company that says these hospitals and doctors are out of network. You can't go see these people, even if they're the only ones you can get to. With Medicare for All, it's a much bigger network of doctors and hospitals that you can see, so you get to keep your same doctors and hospitals, but you cut out the administrative costs of these private insurance companies that, about 25 to 30% of total healthcare costs go to administration. When you look at Medicare, Medicare is only about 2% administration costs. It goes up to about 6 or 7% if you include some of the Medicare Advantage private insurance plans to administer those. But in any scenario, it's significantly less than private insurance companies who, frankly, spend a lot of money on their CEO salaries and administrative waste. Why should a taxpayer have to pay for that? Why do we have a system in the United States of America that puts profits over patients? We need to have a system that ensures that healthcare is a right and not a privilege just reserved for the wealthiest.
Are there any Republicans who support Medicare for All?
There's lots of independents and Republicans across the country who support Medicare for All, but here in Congress, no, they like to they like to term it all kinds of crazy things like socialist. And I always think about how Teddy Roosevelt, Lyndon Johnson, just about anybody who proposed any major program was dealt the same thing, where, people tried to tar a program that has universal benefit and is necessary for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness by calling it socialist. So they have no better plan. In fact, under the Republicans, they have continued to undermine healthcare in this country, strip the Affordable Care Act. We have the opportunity to do something really phenomenal, which is allow Americans to go to bed at night and wake up in the morning not worrying about how they're going to pay these unbelievably high healthcare costs.
And you say taxes would not have to go up at all, including, for example, if you include premiums for private healthcare insurance, that the budget that the average family spends
would go down. The average family would spend less on healthcare costs than they do today, because remember, even if you buy insurance on the marketplace, the average family is spending about $20,000 a year on healthcare costs. So you have to think about what the system is costing people today. And even employers are facing this. Employer costs are going up substantially, and they are paying for some of it on their own, making them less competitive than all of their other counterparts in Europe, where, those industrialized countries, our peer countries, provide healthcare for everybody through a similar kind of government system with some changes, of course. But they're having trouble competing. And then for small businesses, this has been interesting. We have a new Medicare, Businesses for Medicare for All coalition. And there are a lot of small and medium-sized businesses who are just begging us to please, please, please do Medicare for All, because it's hurting their bottom line, but also they want to be able to provide health care for their employees. They don't want to lose employees because they can't provide health care. So we've made tremendous progress on this. We have a letter that's signed by over 250 economists talking about how this is necessary. There's a great phrase that Warren Buffett uses. He says that our current healthcare system is the tapeworm of economic competitiveness in America. It's holding us back. We have an incredible coalition of unions You wouldn't always know it listening to the presidential debates, but I'll tell you, remarkable coalition of unions that is supporting healthcare because they really see that stagnant wages of their workers is directly tied to the rising cost of healthcare.
Thank you so much for your time. This has been extremely enlightening. Really appreciate it. That's it for this edition. Please follow me on Twitter and visit our website, pbs.org/to the contrary. And whether you agree or think to the contrary, see you next week.
Funding for To the Contrary provided by the Cornell Douglas Foundation, committed to encouraging stewardship of the environment, land conservation, watershed protection, and eliminating harmful chemicals. Additional funding provided by the Wallace Genetic Foundation, the Colcom Foundation, and the Charles A. Freoff Foundation. For a transcript or to see an online version of this episode of To the Contrary, please visit our PBS website at pbs.org/To the Contrary.
Be more PBS.